Hey there guys, it's Metro, and today we are going to be making a video where I give my opinions on the things that truly make Classic World of Warcraft a unique product. And in doing so, hopefully I'll elucidate why I am actually still really excited for Classic, despite all the things I've been saying about it in the recent weeks. This is a list of things that I feel Classic World of Warcraft has as a unique element to hang over any other expansion's head, not just current WoW, that being BFA at the time of recording this. With that in mind, we'll also be playing Devil's Advocate at the end and discussing features that could work a lot better alongside these unique elements to enhance the overall product that is Classic. So let's begin by talking about the things Classic definitely does better, in my opinion. All right, tier one, number one. I'm just kidding. Number one is definitely leveling, though. It has to be, right? I mean, it can be argued that leveling is essentially the main feature of Classic WoW, as it's the only era in the game where you need to spend multiple days actively working on the leveling process and progressing through a whopping 60 levels that will require a dozen or so zones to accomplish. Up until 7.3.5, leveling felt like a complete afterthought in just about every single expansion. This is including the Burning Crusade and Wrath of the Lich King. As soon as the mid-TBC comes around, they're already beginning major nerfs to the time needed to get to 1 to 60, and that would receive even heavier nerfs throughout Wrath and of course the Cataclysm, to the point now where it's hard to remember just how much time and effort it used to take to maximize a character. I personally have always longed for Classic's leveling process, because every expansion, it seems almost begrudgingly, includes more and more levels, if only to introduce us to more and more storylines and force us to interact with the new world they created. I worry that this is the only thing making an expansion an actual expansion, and even though I would prefer if 9.0 did not include a new 10 level edition, I honestly don't know what they could do in lieu of that. Leveling has gotten a lot better since late Legion through BFA, and I've been having a lot of fun doing leveling challenges when I can on live. But even with all the extra incentives, it still seems like a complete afterthought in the brains of most players, and definitely not actively supported gameplay via development hours. I, for one, hope if we learn anything from official Classic release that can be brought to the live game, it's the value of the early game progression, as learning and exploring the world immediately, rather than at the end of some leveling process, helps foster a more concrete social playing field and will help the player engage with their class and form a stronger bond to its specific identity. When leveling matters more, you see more people saying things like, I play a mage in World of Warcraft, instead of I play DPS in World of Warcraft. Number 2, large group content. One thing that should be abundantly obvious about Classic is that it's the only version of the game that has ever properly supported full 40-man raid groups for its entirety of content. Perhaps, as a technical reason, it seemed like from the start that 40-man groups would be the single largest raid group ever possible, and that has not changed over the years. But there was a hint of them seemingly accepting that size into any function where a raid group was acceptable, as you can see with many dungeons and early content having its size changed or fixed as the game progressed. Alterac Valley, the only 40-man battleground in the game for quite a while, still resonates in the hearts of players today, and was most noticeably unique even against other Classic elements for being a near sandbox-like scenario where the players may never actually win or lose if no cohesive strategy or action was pursued. This is what caused the famous multi-day AVs, and likely what led to the eventual addition of reinforcements, as without some ticking clock, it wasn't always possible to even imagine a victory for either side if players weren't coordinated or serious about the battle ending. For me, however, my favorite element of Classic has always been 40-man PvE though. Even though I have been leading a progression raiding guild on the developing version of World of Warcraft since mid-Wrath of the Lich King, some small part of me still only does it because I wish I could have been more developed and capable of leadership in the original Classic product. To lead and organize a group of 40 human beings honestly feels like something to put on the resume, and is an absolute total juxtaposition to how live raiding has worked for a very long time now. In Classic, raiding was just that, keeping that many people attentive and focused on working towards a goal while having a few people handle what little mechanics each boss presented at any given time. It felt like an actual raid. In modern WoW, starting as early as the Burning Crusade, raiding was a finely tuned experience meant to test the players as a unit and then as individuals, with the latter getting more and more prominent as the years went on. If you were to look at any typical boss in Battle for Azeroth, you would see macro scale organization basically ends when you pull the boss. You prepare as much as you can as a group before, but when the fight begins, it's all about informational tactics and pinpoint response. You need to be aware of so many different things as an individual, and since Legion, if you react poorly to any one of those things, you will die, and your death will likely make dealing with those mechanics so much harder it will cascade into assured failure. In Classic, the only way to describe it is the exact opposite. Many guilds have killed many bosses with less than 40 people, and truly, 40-man feels like a suggestion rather than something they tune around. With a fully dedicated 40 people all properly geared, many raid fights will last a fraction of the time a BFA boss would, and without the multiple phases of encounters that we began to see dominate design style in TBC and onward, that would basically turn most bosses into straight up tank and spank. Up through BWL, most boss mechanics would never even interact with most players, and there was very little avoidable damage like there is today. Truly, Classic rating difficulty is all about the leadership and organization of 40 unique individuals, and because of that, it was always going to have a fondness in my memory no matter how rating has changed over the years. Number 3, The World. The game is called the World of Warcraft, but after the expansions came rolling out, this feels less and less accurate and almost ironic. As big as the World of Warcraft itself is, so is the reason the world needs to be a focal part of the game for it to feel like a proper MMORPG. Many will cite things like realm culture, but this wasn't unique to Classic and was arguably more present in TBC or Wrath, where that culture all shifted to competitive hierarchy. Many people might bring up activities in the world, and that's, say, expansions like MoP or Legion with their dailies and world quests have far more purpose for having players out in the world. But there is a definite reality and purpose to the world in Classic, and I feel it is because of these 3 unique things. Number 1, each zone actually matters. This is mostly thanks to the prominence of leveling, but this is unique to Classic in a way that seemingly the developers of the game have forgotten how to replicate. In late Legion, they took one step closer to remembering with the scaling tech, but how is it that a game this big is still possible that there isn't at least some sort of relevant reason for characters to check back on previous zones after they progressed past them? It just doesn't make any sense. Number 2, the world size. Not many people will note that Eastern Kingdoms and Kalimdor are the 2 largest continents in the game by surface area, and of course they had to be, as they contain the most zones and the largest range of content. But for me, I'm going to take the opposite approach. I look at Classic's world as being the perfect size, not too big at all, but not too small either. This goes hand in hand with the first point here. But when every zone matters and they all interconnect in such a way, you can easily find the world feeling pretty cozy, and each continent being broken down into subsections of activity, like how Westfall, Redridge, and Duskwood all kind of overlap in this narrow way and can be traversed through regularly as part of the progression of the area. And number 3, the most important reason the world is a defining element of the early days of World of Warcraft is because of how you traveled. Travel in Classic was very deliberate and clearly on the minds of whomever developed the game. Because every zone matters, and the size of every zone is as it is, it makes traveling through them or past them something that takes a lot of time. There are portals and hearthstones in the game, but they are not something that you can just abuse to no end like you could do starting in the Burning Crusade and getting really bad throughout Wrath and later expansions. In order to get from Orgrimmar to Daenerys, you need to take what might be a 20-some minute flight path, but that's only after you got that flight path first. Keenly different to how Cataclysm and After decided to treat the game. In order to actually get to a zone you've never been in, you needed to navigate to it in the first place. This is probably one of my favorite things about Classic and still resonates with me to this day as I'm doing the leveling challenges. Actually traveling on the ground to a new zone is a very central idea to an RPG feeling. And when they started adding dozens of portals and flights to places you have never been before, it really shortened the concept of world travel itself. This is compounded on in many content types, as say only a warlock could summon people without instant summoning zones, or say in order to queue for battlegrounds, you need to talk to a specific NPC in a specific location, and all but a handful of dungeons were in places exclusively devised for said dungeon, which overall makes the whole game feel like a proper adventure around a world. Honestly, in my opinion, the biggest mistake this game has ever made was introducing flying. Flying in the Burning Crusade worked relatively well and had a purpose other than just making travel too quick thanks to the Netherstorm instances, but once Cataclysm was out, allowing flying in the old continents ushered in a development mentality that travel and the world in general were no longer core things they wanted people spending time on. I, for one, hope if we are to learn anything from Classic for the progressing game, we can find a way to make the world a better entity as a whole, as there is effectively no reason to ever visit many old zones, and the ones people do visit, they just take portals to or fly over without ever interacting with the world or the players on the ground. As you can tell, with the recent removal of portals and the constant looming presence of Pathfinder, a lot of players in the live game have gotten very used to this convenience, and I am hoping Classic can be used as a test chamber to better explain why that convenience is in direct contradiction to the purpose of the World of Warcraft. Alright, number 4 is difficulty. This is an extremely divisive topic, and that alone is a good enough reason to consider it unique to Classic for this list, but you may be surprised to hear my take on why it is truly one of the best things about Classic. As mentioned in the rating section, I've been a competitive WoW PvEer for almost a decade now, and I'm not going to submit to the illusion that Classic WoW is particularly difficult to play at any high level. The rotations are plainly and exceedingly simple, the fights are very macro scale in their difficulty instead of on the individual, and up until recent private server prominence, there was no reliable way to even judge yourself against yourself or against other players like might be done with websites like Raider.io or Warcraft Logs. But that is exactly why Classic is unique. Now, friend and guildmate Jesse Cox may have said it best recently, so I'll let him explain.
Like, just having a good time, being dumb, and it still was a ton of fun. It wasn't like over stressful. It wasn't this thing where like, well, if you don't know the mechanics of this fight, you're screwed. It wasn't stressful. It didn't feel like you had 50 million things on your bars and you had to micromanage every single one of them. It's kind of one of the parts of current WoW that I'm just like, ugh, why is there so much stuff? Especially for a shaman.
So his genuine reaction to Classic is actually what made me rethink my stance on this topic, and I can better see the appeal here now thanks to him. For a long while, I've said that Classic is a much more casual and potentially noob-friendly product, and I think that is similar to what Jesse is saying there, but for actually very different reasons. He and many others have come to realize that when you strip away the over-complexities of modern WoW, you find you are better able to enjoy the content for what it's meant to be, and the difficulty curve can be much easier to create and keep steady. For example, the hardest part about Classic may very well be having the time and patience to get through the things it might deliver. This looming time sink, coupled with the tighter tuning of open world creatures, the lack of gear handed out, and the overall simplicity of classes and specs actually creates a much more well-rounded difficulty in the entirety of the game. Brings up the difficulty in daily tasks significantly, but lowers the difficulty and personal responsibility of the endgame content, turning the entire game into a progression of learning and skill, instead of just one specific pathway that you might have with mythic rating, and oftentimes removing the overly stressful situations that you also would find in there. This is very healthy for a new player and encourages players to want to immerse themselves in the entire experience instead of only, say, Mythic Plus like you might see in BFA. But that is of course aided by the lack of minute pathways that weren't added until later expansions after Classic. In the end, I've been using an analogy to compare the difficulties of Classic and Modern WoW for some time now, and I believe it still holds quite true. Modern WoW's difficulty is like building a house with every tool available, where Classic's difficulty is like cutting a plank of wood with a wrench. In the modern game, the analogy really creates a nice parallel, because just like you may now be able to watch entire videos and guides on how to build a house from scratch and go from perhaps a novice to an expert thanks to the help of others, you can download and create add-ons and UIs that will significantly improve the amount of information you are able to process, and the direction you can progress your character changes rapidly because of such. Original Classic, of course, did not feature this, or things like DPS meters and parse culture, but frankly, that is not something you should expect to see happen again. I'm hoping though that without this massive sudden spike in difficulty going from extremely easy to extremely taxing like we might have with Battle for Azeroth, there won't be a need for those special measurements and tools, and people will be able to simply enjoy the overall difficulty of the game for what it is to them. Either way, Classic is the truest self-contained difficulty curve I have ever experienced in any multiplayer game, and even though its endgame isn't something you will spend thousands of attempts progressing on, it should still be something you will come to enjoy, even if it means regressing a bit back to the days of your youth. Alright, and number 5, perhaps the most unique thing overall is it's never gonna change? Question mark? I feel like it's odd putting this one on this list because it's obviously not an intended feature that was designed into the game 15 years ago, but it is arguably going to be the most unique part of the official World of Warcraft Classic product launching this August. They're seemingly going to be sticking with a singular design for years, that being the way things were in 1.12, even though it will likely make a lot of content considerably easier and will alter the memories of many people's favorite classes. Either way, unless they deviate from this, this is the only time the World of Warcraft product will ever feature a multi-year stretch without major class changes. Let that sink in. After 15 years of hot fixes and patches, this will be the first time you can level a paladin today and know that years from now, the paladin will function the exact same way. Of course, this is in direct opposition to how it was in actual Classic, where they basically had no idea what they were doing with classes whatsoever and redesigned major elements of every class at least once throughout the entire product. This has always been an odd topic for World of Warcraft and has greatly impacted me at least once. Coming off WoD, I was very happy with the state of Holy Pally, but with Legion, they decided to change the way the spec functioned from the ground up. In the end, I eventually grew to like Holy Pally again, but it certainly wasn't anywhere near as fun as I remembered it being, and those types of changes have created a situation where I end up longing for older designs, almost just to see Paladin's previous iterations. As this is unprecedented, I am not sure how I will actually feel about this yet, because it does does mean that if there is something I dislike about a spec, I would not eventually find changes to make me like it more like I would on live. For example, the coming tank changes in 8.2, especially to Vengeance Demon Hunter, has turned a class I basically didn't play at all to one I am playing again very actively in preparation for those coming adjustments. I feel this is a very big double-edged sword in that way, but in the end, it is a very, very unique element about Classic WoW's new face, and something that likely will end up having a major impact on how players perceive the product and how it is ultimately received years down the road. So those are the 5 biggest things I feel that Classic WoW does better than any other expansion or WoW iteration we have yet to see. The list could go on for sure, and one thing I would have liked to have added was the focus on consumables and how they had no in-combat CD alongside world buffs, which could easily double the power of your character. However, just to keep things balanced, I would now like to offer 4 short things in the opposite direction, i.e. things that Classic WoW does uniquely poorly, if only to prevent this wave of optimism we see around Classic from being perpetuated with this video. I firmly believe it's healthy to understand what you love and don't love about any one thing if you plan on being attached to it for a very long time, and Classic WoW is no different. So let's begin. Okay, number 1 is gearing. Gearing is easily the thing that sticks out to me as the sorest spot in the game in Classic, and many will initially feel the opposite. But when you actually sit down and take a look at the loot tables, you should begin to understand my position more. Especially when compared to even the Burning Crusade, there's absolutely an appalling number of items that are just totally worthless. So much so that green BOEs would be more valuable. You can tell they had very little idea what they were doing with gear and how it dropped, and the lack of power between the different tiers of gear is very clear. Many people may be shocked to find that dungeon gear, especially thanks to the stat revision they will be choosing to not revert in this product, is just better than a lot of gear through Molten Core and even BWL. And it gets quite hilarious when 20-some people are all rolling on one of 2 or 3 items that might even drop from some of the bosses in there. What's worse, in my eyes, is many bosses, especially in Molten Core and many 5-mans, drop say a spread of 6 or so items on their entire table, and only one of those items is ever worth having for any player in your entire raid group. You'll be doing dungeon runs for weeks trying to get that one item to drop, and meanwhile, the other items will be filling up your bags. This amount of tedium has led to a mentality on private servers that people should just reserve the gear they want if it drops, because it's so valuable compared to the other items that might drop, it's just not worth the risk of someone else taking it, and that has subsequently led to high-value players selling their services to further such. If this practice continues into the live Classic product, I'm going to be very ashamed of the community, but it could easily be remedied by Blizzard by limiting the use of master loot in 5-mans, where I feel the option simply has no legitimate usage. Number 2, dungeon content. Obviously, if you know me, dungeon content is essentially my favorite pastime in World of Warcraft. I love raiding, but I spend most of my in-game hours in dungeons, and that is thanks to systems like Mythic Plus and challenge modes before it that offer difficult and replayable content. However, Classic squarely does dungeons the worst out of any iteration of WoW in my eyes. To me, the greatest addition they could make to Classic would be a heroic dungeon difficulty, especially for the leveling ones. There are many amazing dungeons in Classic, and the Dire Maul and Black Rock set still are among my favorite dungeons anywhere in any version of the game, but it's almost a shame that the leveling dungeons just get left behind without any max level component to them. More so, as early as the Burning Crusade, they learned that dungeons should have some level of replayability past just gearing, and that is absolutely the biggest failure of the Classic dungeon system. Without things like the daily dungeon quest or badges, there are very few reasons to rerun dungeons other than just helping your friends, and that is another reason why things like tanks selling their services and reserving gear have become so commonplace on private servers. Okay, number 3, talents. Another thing most people would likely disagree with me on at first glance, but for me, Classic has the worst endgame talent iteration the game has ever seen. To be clear, it works well enough for leveling, and as mentioned, leveling is a major part of the time you will spend on your characters, and this is a big reason why many people will cite the old-style talent system as superior. So I totally agree with that, but where it falls super flat is at max level. There are only a handful of real choices, but some of them are so important that you'll have to constantly evaluate your talents just to have them, or completely gimp your desired build to do so. Compared to TBC and Wrath, who use the same talent style, Classics is just very basic. Many classes and specs flat out rely on the final point in each tree to even have identity, and this complicates the element of choice people always cite further. I feel like a system where you got to pick a few major talents, and like the 31-point talents, etc., and then a bunch of the passives or smaller talents would have been much more favorable than a linear progression through each each tree, being forced to take whatever was leading up to the conclusion just to get what you wanted out of it. It certainly would have functioned to create a better hybrid scenario and more flexibility in what you were taking. The worst issue overall, though, is actually switching the talents themselves. One of the biggest positive things people say about Classic's talents are, of course, the ability to mix and match and create these hybrid builds, but you are heavily penalized for trying to do so, unlike with Wrath and onwards, and even by the Burning Crusade, gold availability had creeped so high you could easily afford it a lot quicker. As someone who will play a Paladin in Classic, I would be a lot more excited about the class if I knew I could switch between the multiple spec layouts that I find fun to play without having to dump a bundle of consumables worth of gold each time I want to do it, especially if, for example, I wanted to heal raids in the evening and tank dungeons in the afternoon. Luckily, Classic's talents lack that major impact, like I mentioned from TBC and onwards, and many hybrid builds offer 80+% viability for those not looking to grind gold for hours a week just to experiment. So in the end, the problem's poor design sort of just solves itself here. And finally, number 4, all the work has already been done. I wanted to make this my final point here to mirror the unique situation we described with the no changes thing in the first half of the list, as this again will be the other half of the situation we need to battle with in this Classic re-release. Classic WoW is an interesting product in many ways, but there is this particularly unique mix of people's exuberance for maximization of what they believe to be a challenging product, but just how old some of the content is actually going to be in this product. This is what I would point to as the source of many arguments around Classic WoW, and actually creates the most unique scenario I personally have ever encountered in any games community. There is just no mystery anymore. Nothing will be changing, and there is, at least at the time of making this video, no concrete plans for any new challenges to come out that people would have to theorycraft over and learn as a community to complete. You can already find full BIS lists for every class in every scenario, thousands and thousands of hours of guides and footage of every boss and dungeon in the game, and you can even go on the live version of the game to test many of the encounters you might face in Classic in a trivially easy test environment. I worry greatly that this will be the death of competition, and with that, longevity of the product. And it is particularly worrying to me how many people think that despite the fact that all the game's progression has already been mapped out ad nauseum, that there will still be some competitive level of difficulty to rally around and be impressed by. For me, one of my favorite things in World of Warcraft is always tackling the new content. Gradually getting better and better at the activities presented is what I love the most about video games in general, especially with WoW. And a massive part of that is my growth rate with comparison to my peers. I feel like distinguishing yourself in a social community is all about the rate at which you have progressed with respect to others. But when that baseline is already set before the product even launches, what will take its place? I'm sure there will be some quirks people still find and develop new strategies around, and those potential pioneers do offer me at least some room for optimism. But until I see it with my own eyes, I feel this is an issue entirely unique to Classic, and one that will unfortunately define the product in the years to come as much as anything else out there. So those are a few of the many things that will be very unique about the new Classic product coming in August, and that will hopefully make Classic stand out as a unique product compared to other versions of WoW and also other video games on the market. I specifically only mentioned 5 positives and 4 negatives, mostly for the sake of brevity, but also because I wanted the video to be more positive than negative by default. There are many things people look to for and against Classic, but most of them aren't actually unique to Classic and might actually be done better in, say, the Burning Crusade. I made this video because I wanted to offer logical comparisons of features of this specific product, especially to temper the almost euphoric feeling around the Classic beta right now. You should be excited for Classic, and these are some of the reasons why. It's a very unique product, especially in 2019, and it will be played very differently than many modern games for some of these reasons, but will also be looked at in a very different light for some of these reasons. If you're excited, that's great, but understanding why you are and should be excited should be just as much of a part of the process, as this is a product you will hopefully be playing for years to come, not just for a few fleeting months. If you and everyone else are going to enjoy Classic for years past its previous lifespan, step 1 should be a healthy understanding of what is unique about the product and how that can translate into a sustainable future for you. I hope I have helped offer that here today, and I look forward to reading your thoughts. I love to hear specific things you guys think Classic does uniquely well or uniquely poorly, but please try to keep in mind that we are discussing things that Classic itself does uniquely. initially, not just things from the first few years of WoW. I'll be refraining from reading or replying to any of the comments posted initially, and then after some time, I will release a separate video where I then go through and reply to every single comment made at that time in order to give better, more detailed responses and answers, and also to avoid having my voice be one that is a primary influence on the organic discussion that takes place in the comment sections on YouTube. As always, thanks for watching. I look forward to reading your replies, and I'll see you in the next video.